Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And just to give you a little bit of a recap of what we do in these sessions, and if you're watching this on video here, it's an interactive session. We have folks online. Then I chat and hopefully get interrupted periodically. But what we'll go through is the news of the week in the solar industry. Then I'll highlight a few of the upcoming webinars, things of that nature. And then we try and go into a deep dive on a subject that I've found interesting in the solar industry this week. And this week, what we're going to touch on is should the grid in the United States be nationalized? So just to give you a little background on that, I've been thinking about this, wondering, there's a lot of reasons for it, probably a lot of reasons against it. And I just thought, well, let's look at this and take a look, because the grid is clearly in trouble and it's very important. So, okay, so let's jump on in and talk about what's happening in the news here. And I should say that perhaps it's not surprising that politics enter into politics, basically. There's a recent report that shows that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has allocated $114 billion towards renewable energy manufacturing infrastructure. And of that $114 billion, about half of it has been allocated to 6 key swing states, states that are going to be vital in the upcoming presidential election. About $53.6 billion of this money has been allocated to Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. Most of this funding is going to be going towards building of electric vehicles. There's also battery plants that are going to be constructed, as well as plants that manufacture components for wind and solar systems. The last 2 coal power plants in New England are now slated to be shut down. Both of these are operated by Granite Shore Power. They're both located in New Hampshire. One is going to be shut down in 2025. The second one, the last one, will be shut down in 2028. This action will make New Hampshire the 16th state in the country that has no coal power plants. And this is quite a change over the last 14 years. In 2010, coal accounted for about 44% of the nation's electrical generation. By 2019, 289 plants had been closed down. That represented about 40% of the generating capacity from coal. By 2023, coal was just 17% of the nation's grid, and an additional 173 coal power plants are slated to be closed by 2030. This will bring coal's generation percentage down to about less than 10% of the nation's grid by 2030. A report by an organization known as Clean Investment Monitoring has reported that 5% of the nation's private investment, not government, but private investment, is now in renewable energy or clean infrastructure, the purchase of the structures, the equipment, and durable goods as part of that. EV, or electric vehicle investment, is the largest share of this, followed by wind and solar systems, the arrays, both roof-mounted and large utility scale. And then there's been a lot of investment in clean energy technologies like carbon capture or green building techniques. There, in related news, MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, just released a report that says that the incentives from the IRA, from the Inflation Reduction Act, have actually doubled the reduction in carbon emissions within the United States, the rate of reduction. That's a little bit awkward to say there. The rate of carbon emissions is going down, and now the decrease has doubled after the IRA. That's the good news. The bad news is that in order to meet the climate goals that have already been established for 2030, and also to meet the goal of being net zero by 2050, the rate of decline actually has to triple. So partway there, not all the way there on that. Queues for connecting power systems to the grid, they were already long and they just got a lot longer. In 2023, the waiting time increased by 30% for those power generating stations known as interconnecting those systems trying to get onto the grid. The wait has increased by 30%. According to a study by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, the queues have grown 8-fold over the last decade or so. In 2010, the grid queue, the interconnection queue was about half of the existing capacity of the grid. In other words, the grid had a generating capacity of 972 gigawatts, and there were 462 gigawatts of power plants waiting to be built, waiting for approval from the queue. Today, in 2023, this is flipped to where now there's twice as much capacity waiting to be built as exists on the current grid. So the grid has a capacity, a generating capacity of 1,279 gigawatts, and there are 2,598 gigawatts in the queue waiting to be built. Now, that doesn't mean all of those are going to be built. In fact, a lot of these systems are now applying because there's such a long wait. So a lot of this is speculative, but it's definitely a problem. In 2023, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, issued interconnection reforms. And these reforms are sorely needed. As you can see, the wait times are getting longer. And one of the reasons why the wait times are getting longer is it's basically the utilities who have to agree to let their competition hook up to the grid. So it'd be like a store owner having to apply to Walmart in order to get permission to build their store. So they're not really helping this process along. The average delay for an application now is over 5 years. In some regions like PJM, which is the regional authority that governs the area from New York all the way over to Chicago, they announced in 2022 that they wouldn't even look at new applications until 2025. So the pent-up demand for this might be larger than the queues indicate, because a lot of applicants have just simply not even applied because they know they're not going to be looked at for a period of years. And Maryland is the first state in the union that has now mandated that utilities must allow for vehicle-to-grid bidirectional charging for electric vehicles. So this is going to be important. This allows that, of course, you can charge your electric vehicle, but then your electric vehicle can discharge back to the grid. It can either be sold to the grid or amalgamated with other electric vehicles to create a virtual power plant, or it could service your home, or it could service the building where they're plugged in. Well, this is a technology that's just about ready to come on the scene. Maryland is saying, okay, utilities, we know you like to get in the way on these things. We're going to tell you, you have to allow this to happen. The legislation was known as DRIVE, the DRIVE Act, and the DRIVE Act is one of those torturous acronyms, stands for Distributed Renewable Integration and Vehicle Electrification. So they love those things. So that was passed, and basically the legislation says that the Public Service Commission must have the rules for this in place by May of 2025. And that's the news that I've run across. Does anybody have anything else that came across your desk that you want to add into the mix before we move on to the webinars? Give you just a second to pop up there. If not, we'll jump into the announcements for upcoming. So on April 17th at 11 a.m., that's tomorrow, decarbonization within the steel and aluminum industry, kind of maybe very specific, but if you're into that, what the heck? April 22nd, this one's geared towards utilities, talking about when we're talking about a decentralized grid, what's the new customer experience there? April 23rd at 1 p.m., the importance of doing environmental assessments early in site development for larger systems. The 23rd at 2 p.m., diversity within apprenticeship programs, how to make that happen. And once again, I'll just mention for those of you new to this, I don't really give you all the links to this. I'm just making you aware these things exist, and I'll leave it up to you to find them out there on the grid. There's this thing called Google. If you haven't run into it, you can use that. On April 23rd, 2 p.m., Solus Hybrid Inverter System webinar. If you're considering that one, the 24th at 2 p.m., a solar tracker project system. 25th at 2 p.m., how to deal with post-sales, the workflows that are involved in that, the follow-up after you've sold the project. The 30th at 7 p.m., that there's going to be a one for end users focused on how battery technologies are going to change your life. And on May 2nd, the Midwest Sustainability Summit is going to be held in Cincinnati. Make you aware of that. And on the 20th through the 23rd in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University, ACES is going to be hosting their annual conference. So if you're in that area or going there, I'm going to be there. We're going to actually have a booth. What do you know? So we'll see you there. And June 2nd or 5th and 6th, there's a virtual conference that's being hosted by Aurora Solar. That's going to be up. And then June 12th through the 13th, a Solar and Storage Summit in San Francisco. And then, of course, we have our online courses and our in-person and hybrid courses that are available through solarpvtraining.com. So that's my shameless plug for that. And those are the events that I have. Again, I'll throw it open to the group, and anybody who has something they want to plug or make everybody aware of, jump on in with that. All right, hearing none, I'm gonna jump into the topic of the day, because again, this is something I've been thinking about. And I actually was speaking to a fellow from the National Renewable Energy Labs, and we were talking about some of the issues with the grid and some of the issues with the utilities. And my suggestion to him is that we may run into a time in the not too distant future when there is serious talk about nationalizing the electrical grid. That may sound a bit far-fetched at the moment. I don't know. But I think it's something to consider. So I decided, okay, well, this week we're going to consider it. So I would love you guys to argue with me or agree. That's fine. So let me change the focus on this because my notes don't reflect it. So first, I think we've got to discuss what is the grid? You know, what comprises the grid? We've got essentially three different major portions of the electric grid. There's generation, and the generation is basically the power plants. That has traditionally been the generation component, although that is beginning to shift more and more towards distributed generation. We'll touch on that in a bit. There's transmission, that are the high voltage power lines that take the power from the generation plants to the local distribution grid. And then there's distribution. So basically the transmission takes it from the power plant to the substation, all of those little fenced in things that you see a lot of equipment in your neighborhood. And then it goes out onto all of the power lines and are distributed to the various homes and businesses locally. So those are the three main portions of the electrical grid in the US. So what does this look like? Well, if we jump in traditionally, we've seen that the power grid has coal power plants, there were nuclear power plants, there were natural gas power plants, there were some hydro power plants. So those have been the traditional generating facilities up until the last decade or so. And then the power lines that go from those to the distribution grid are quite high voltage, usually 100,000 volts, maybe 700,000 for some of the interstate type transmission lines. There are some smaller power plants that might be part of this transmission system that are integrated in, and then you jump into the distribution grid. So the distribution, I think when most people think of the electric grid, that's what they're thinking about mostly. Their local electric company, and it's taking all of this power that's coming in, and it's distributing it to the homes and to the businesses around. And now we're beginning to see the distributed energy sources coming into that mix and changing that mix a bit. And hopefully we'll get a little bit into that discussion as well, to see that essentially what has always been is not necessarily what is going to be. So I think most people, they get into this mindset that the way things are the way things have always been, and that's just simply not the case. An example of that, in post-World War II, the grid was almost entirely powered by hydro systems right in the 1940s. I think if my memory serves, it was about 85% of the power on the grid. Problem with that is hydro is only located where there is water sources with enough of a head on it, the difference between where the water is and where it's going, to generate electricity. So then coal power plants became more and more abundant because they could be located almost anywhere. Then, of course, we saw natural gas competing with coal. And it really wasn't until about 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago, that wind began to seriously be economically competitive with with coal and natural gas. Then it's only been about the last 10 years when solar became economically competitive with natural gas and coal. Today's mix, we're really seeing, well, over the last 8 or 9 years, the mix of generating has really been a competition between wind, solar, and natural gas. And now, over the next decade, the competition for powering the grid is really a competition between wind, solar, and battery technology. Natural gas you can think of as a battery. It's just stored sunlight, stored in the form of a fossil fuel and stored over many, many millions of years, but it is still just stored sunlight. It's there to provide power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. Well, batteries can do that as well. So we can use stored sunlight there. So we're in this transition there. All of this is happening for pure economic reasons. Well, the utility is a natural monopoly, pretty much. I mean, if there ever was a thing that could be defined as a natural monopoly, the power grid has traditionally been that. There's basically, I pulled this definition from somewhere, but when there were very high barriers to entry, I couldn't go out and build a coal power plant in order for my home to get electricity. Just too much of a barrier to entry. Plus, not anybody could just go in and build competing power lines because you had right-of-way issues, and so once the right-of-ways have been issued to a company or to an entity, you're not going to get additional power lines competing against it. So whoever controls those right-of-ways controls the flow of electricity. So it has been a natural monopoly. I would argue that's changing. That I couldn't build a coal power plant, but I can sure build a solar power plant. And I can build it at about twice the cost per watt of capacity than the local utility can build it. So if they're going to charge me twice wholesale to retail, and now they're actually charging 3 or 4 times wholesale for retail, well, I can outcompete them. The barrier to entry there has disappeared. And if I can generate my power where I'm going to consume it in a distributed model, the barrier to entry of power lines and right-of-ways and all of that disappears as well. Not only for homeowners, but for business owners, for campuses, for complexes, for office parks, all of those things. So the natural monopoly position of electricity is disappearing in many respects. In many respects. So the whole fundamental basis that this system is built upon is changing, and we need to look at, should we change everything else about it? I think that's just important. In class, we often talk about, why do we do things the way we do them? And the answer is always because that's the way we do it, right? Somebody thought of it at some point. Why do we use AC electricity instead of DC? It's because Tesla was smarter than Edison. All right, is it still the right answer? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. So that's kind of the purpose of this discussion here. So we're currently, or in the last few decades, going in the opposite direction. A lot of these countries had developed national grids owned publicly, and they've decided that privatization is kind of the way to go. We see this a lot in European nations. We saw it here in the United States. There's a sort of a truism that has grown up in our dialogue, that government is inefficient, government is cumbersome, government is expensive, is bloated, government is the problem, it's not the solution, and all of that. Private industry can do it better. I don't know that that's played out in reality. I mean, every time I deal with AEP, I'm not joyous that it's privately owned. I'm thinking the government probably might be a little more responsive. That's kind of, because at least I can vote those guys out of office. I can't do anything to the AEP guys. So I'm not 100% sure that this move towards privatization does anything but hand profits from a monopoly into private hands. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. My must be my Minnesota upbringing or whatever. So what are we? So who currently owns and manages the grid? Right. Well, there are individual generators. Right. The grid is an amalgam of things. And I'll tell you, researching all of this is not so easy to figure out who owns things, where things are, how it's managed. But the individual generators are things like coal power plants, natural gas power plants, hydroelectric power plants, nuclear power plants, wind, solar. Then you get into transmission lines. Tell you, trying to find out who owns transmission lines is, again, not easy. The answer is usually utilities. Well, what utility? Where? When do they stop? How do they connect? How does all this stuff work? Well, they're owned or they're managed and regulated by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And then they're also overseen by RTOs, regional transmission organizations. I'll show you a map of some of those RTOs. So there are jurisdictions, and different jurisdictions have different rules, and so it's kind of an amalgam and weird. Most countries have a nationwide system. The United States does not. Then the United States has a bunch of little systems that are all supposed to work together. And if you've ever tried to work in a committee, you know just how easy that is. And then you get into the distribution system, and those aren't even federally organized. Those are all state organized. And one of the things I was talking to the guy from NREL about is just simply how corrupt the oversight of these the public utility commissions. I mean, it's so blatant. These things are controlled by the utility companies. Just to give you an example, in the state of Ohio, the head of the Public Utility Commission here in the state of Ohio received a $6 million consulting fee, right, from First Energy a week before he was appointed to be chairman of the Public Utility Commission by the governor, who had also received money from First Energy. And there's a big scandal around all of that with $70 million of money being given to the state legislature and people going to federal prison and all of that. It was basically a pay to play kind of scheme. So yeah, we've got problems there. So who owns and manages the grid? Well, good question. So let's take a look at generation exactly, right? How is the generation owned and managed here? Well, if we look at the United States in 2021, these were the numbers I could find easily. The generation comes from three main producers. There are some imports from Canada and Mexico, a significant amount. The amount of power that comes from utility-owned generating facilities is there in the middle, and then independent power producers. So there's a lot of independent power producers, especially in the age of renewables. We get investors who are speculatively building wind farms. They're building solar arrays. I don't think any of this incorporates rooftop solar that's owned by the customer. This is all utility scale stuff. So the middle one is kind of what we think of as traditional generation. And of that, it's broken down into essentially three groups. There's co-ops, right? That represents the number there on the left. They don't own a huge amount of generation compared to the areas that they service. The investor owns the a fair share. And then there's a significant amount of government-owned power plants. A lot of these are hydro. You get the Tennessee Valley Authority, you get some up in the Cascades area up in Washington and Oregon and those places. So there's a fair amount of government-owned systems. And then there's municipal power systems and things like that that probably are incorporated in that. So just to give you a sense of this, the utilities own what? 1,400,000. What is that? 1.4 terawatts out of the 4 terawatts. So it's a minority, right? The utilities don't own all of those power plants. I'm not so concerned about power plant generation because, as I mentioned before, that landscape is changing, right? I think private investors are going to build power plants, whether it's a homeowner or a business or an investor. The generation is already being removed from the utilities because the utilities simply are not good at competing on that. And you're seeing that in your electric bill. You're seeing the generation, the transmission, and the distribution being separated on your bill. And they're less concerned about the generation. And part of that's because of deregulation. The government is saying you have to allow consumers a choice. And so you're going to choose somebody who's doing it better than your local utility. So you have a choice in most locations on who you buy your power from, but you don't have a choice on how it's delivered to you. That's going to be your local utility for all practices purposes. So then we look at transmission. And transmission, I just thought it was interesting, this chart here that I found from the Edison Electrical Institute. They're showing this increase in the investment in transmission. But if you look at it, if every year or so, the whole industry is investing $30 billion or so in transmission. And then in one bill, the federal government is investing $73 billion. It strikes me, they're simply subsidizing private businesses. If these businesses are owned and operated privately, how come the federal government has to step in and basically pay for them to upgrade their own facilities? They're not necessarily doing that for my house. So why are they doing it for First Energy or for AEP or those kind of things? So if the federal government's already hugely invested in infrastructure and they're doing it because it's critical, it's a national critical thing, then why are they then turning this over to private enterprise?
Jay, aren't they investing billions in you in the IRA?
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Not billions.
Well, not you personally. I'm just saying that they are investing in the distributed by me, you, and everybody else who gets the credit, because I take advantage of them. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah. And no, you're right, Don. And that's one of the things they're doing there. And so I'm perfectly happy to be a hypocrite on all of this. I'm happy to take the money and then complain that somebody else is taking the money. So I'm just saying that the government has taken this attitude that we are going to spur this thing on. On the other hand, the utilities have always profited by building infrastructure. So their whole business model is basically saying, if you get approved to build your infrastructure, we will guarantee you a profit on that. So I'm not quite sure why then they need to be subsidized on top of that. But I don't know. I don't know, Don. Do you let me get your feedback here since you jumped in, and I can always count on you to disagree with me. So, Don, what's your feedback on this particular thing at the moment?
Well, I think, I think making the grid the government would be another march towards Europe, which is difficult for us. I think, everything you brought up is reasonable, but there is even more dollars going to individuals, in particular large companies that are in the green industry. The only concern I've got about that is the old saying, once they figure out they can buy our votes with our own money, we're dead. And
Yep.
you pointed out that they've targeted a bunch of the swing states.
Sure.
Yeah, so, I think we need to make some changes. We need to do it, how you do it, who gets funded, who's going to come out ahead. Those are all fair things to check and watch closely and see who, there's always going to be somebody gaming the system, whether it's the individuals or the companies.
Yep.
But we'll see. No, I think this is, it's been very interesting so far, Jay.
Okay, well, that's good. Yeah, I just want to point out too that I don't think nobody's going to listen to my suggestions here. I think this is politically almost impossible, but the key word is almost. I've got some other arguments in favor here coming up, but pretty much what I'm thinking, I'll summarize what led me to this thought process. I'm thinking that over the last couple of decades, we've really been geared towards fairly steady level of electrical consumption in this country. If you'll see a chart here in a minute that shows that the amount of electricity being used across the country has really remained pretty stable for the last 2 decades. And now we've embarked on this energy transition that's going to sort of create a hockey stick almost graph of electrical demand. And we're doing this at a time that we're shutting down all of the fossil fuel power plants for economic reasons. On top of that, the utilities are putting barriers in place to allow renewable energy to come on board in any meaningful way, with five-year waits for interconnection of these systems. So how on earth are we going to even meet a stable demand when we're shutting down a lot of power plants and refusing to give access to build all of these new power plants? And then we throw on top of that this new increase in demand, and I'll touch on some of them, but electrification of the vehicles is going to be a big deal. The electrification of industry is going to be huge. Cryptocurrency, the advent of artificial intelligence, all of these things are going to combine to just create this huge demand in electrical demand at a time. Plus, the grid is very unstable and not very well maintained. So all of a sudden, you put all of these things in here, they're corruptly managed. And suddenly we have a problem. Suddenly, everything works fine until it doesn't. And then suddenly a large portion of the United States is without power for a significant period of time. That's going to cause people to say, why is this happening? Why are we faced with this? And I believe at that moment, we're going to begin to hear people discussing, why are we leaving such a critical portion of our economic activity, of our well-being, of our livelihoods, in the hands of people who have demonstrated they cannot handle it? So we need to start talking about this and seeing how that's how that's going to change, because we're in the middle of a paradigm change anyway in what these things are dealing with. So who owns the transmission lines? There are a few different options, but basically because utilities control it, utilities own it. They own almost all of it. Almost all of it. There are some private, but they hit so many hurdles that they're just not really going to be competitive there. So who regulates the transmission lines? It's the US is broken into three main regional connection areas as far as long distance transmission. There's the Western interconnection, the Eastern interconnection, and then Texas, right? Because Texas got to be different. And it's really not all of Texas. It's you know, that little part down there in green. That's one of the reasons why Texas has such problems, because the bigger the interconnection area, the more robust, the more stable it is, because you can take power from one part of that section and move it to another relatively easily. The losses are not huge. The average loss in transmission, really over 1,000 miles even, is only around 6%, because the voltages are so high in these systems. So if you have a problem in Southern California, you can move electricity from Seattle without a lot of problem. But if you have a problem in Dallas, you got to get the power from Texas. So that's why their grid is very unstable there. And then we get into the RTOs, the regional transmission authorities or organizations. And you can see here, there's New England, there's New York, there's PJM. If I remember right, PJM stands for like what, Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Michigan, or Maryland, I think it is. And then mid continental or MISO, Southwest Power, Texas, ERCOT. ERCOT is always in Casio. So those are the authorities, and each one has their own rules and regulations and all of that kind of thing. Then when we get down into the distribution system is about 35% of the cost of all of this. And when we talk about distribution, it's really from the substation to the end user. And these are managed or overseen by the states, not the federal. There are about 5.5 million miles of distribution lines. When you have a power outage, you know, it's usually because a tree fell on one of these power lines or something happened locally. That's where all these outages occur for the most part. And it's old. It's old and it's not very well maintained. In fact, the statistics I found here is 70% of the grid is over 25 years old. So there is an incentive by the utility companies to build new stuff, but there's not an incentive for them to maintain the stuff they got. Sounds like a teenager, right? I want to buy new stuff, but I'm not going to take care of the stuff I've got. So how are we doing so far? All right, so we've got an electrical grid here that has no national plan because it's not nationally managed. We have transmission losses, and even though those losses are only around 6%, it's still 6% is a lot. So if you could be just generating the power where you're using it, you're going to reduce a lot of this infrastructure loss due to transmission. You're also going to reduce a lot of the congestion, because no longer do you have to send power over long distances. And yeah, think about it like traffic on the highway. You know, if you don't have to go those long distances, that's one less car that's out there. You're reducing the congestion on the existing infrastructure. So we can stretch the infrastructure longer without having to build new stuff. There's an increase in power outages. I've got a little diagram on that here in a second. There's a lot more voltage variations. Now, the utilities are going to blame that on distributed energy because you've got a lot of different systems out there feeding into, and perhaps they're right to an extent, but from the reading I've found, there's also problems within their own systems, increasingly because of issues in their own controlled area. And then a lack of capacity, not only a lack of capacity for today's needs, but lack of capacity into the future. When I talk about this hockey stick type demand curve that we're going to be dealing with, the interconnection delays, they're really, really bad right now, and they're just getting worse. I mean, 5 years, really? Come on, that's silly, especially when the need and the demand is right now. There are a lot of vulnerabilities to cyber and terrorist activities. Physical terrorists. We've seen reports of people shooting at substations. There was some speculation that maybe it could just be hooligans, or it could be somebody just trying to see what response time is, how aware these things are, sort of probing vulnerabilities. There is within the cyber, or the infrastructure security world, concern, because there are some key points within the infrastructure where if you knocked out one transmission station or something like that, you could wipe out large sections of the United States, their electric. And most people feel like, okay, power outage, that's fine. I'll be out of power for a day or an hour or a minute or whatever. But these systems, if they go down on that kind of scale, the process of trying to restart them and get them going again may be months long. And if you have a key transformer that was built in Germany, is no longer manufactured, was brought in on rails that are no longer there, how are you going to replace these things quickly? Some of this key infrastructure is going to require weeks or months just to replace it. So imagine the kind of turmoil if the state of New York was without power for a month. The loss of life, the loss of economic activity, the trauma to our psyche, and 5 million New Yorkers ending up in West Virginia. That would be a little bit of a culture clash, I imagine. Okay, so you've got those things. And then, of course, we've seen corruption within these utility companies. I think it was, John, all right, I've forgotten anyone. One of those guys who does the late night sort of comedy things on HBO, but he did a whole series on corruption within utilities. Very, very interesting. So that's an issue. So what about power outages? Well, we are seeing a massive increase in long-term power outages going on across the United States. That's just something that's cyclical and often weather related. But if you follow the trend chart, it's constantly going up. What about prices? Haven't even mentioned the fact that electric prices are rising faster than inflation. That's problematic, right? If you're saying that private industry is managing this thing so great, how come the cost of electricity just keeps going up and up and up and up and up? How come we're seeing all of these corruption issues? Again, maybe government would do it worse, but hard to imagine they could do it any worse than what we're seeing. And as I mentioned, the corruption, we here in Ohio, we suffered through the whole First Energy scandal, where essentially the First Energy paid $70 million to the Ohio State Legislature. The Ohio State Legislature then passed legislation that provided about $2 billion in subsidies to First Energy. The Speaker of the House ended up going to prison. A couple of people, at least one guy, committed suicide as a result of it, and then some of these First Energy guys. So they don't have a very good track record there, but at least they're getting well paid. Some of these guys are making, well, I pulled up, these are some of the top guys, but Florida Power and Light making $40 million a year. Who knows about stock bonuses? Exelon, 300 or 30 million a year. 24 million, 20 million. And these are regulated companies. The folks could argue that, yeah, okay, you're CEO of a very large company. It's very profitable. Of course you should be compensated adequately. Well, who's to say what adequate is? But remember, these are regulated utilities. They're guaranteed to make a profit. It doesn't take great corporate management because no matter how badly you do, you're guaranteed to make a profit. So we saw that with the regulated Bell company back when I was in telecom. Some of these guys just thought they were geniuses, but once they got into the whole deregulated world, it just all fell apart for them because they didn't know how to manage. If you're given all of your rules and regulations and then you're told no matter what you do, you're going to make a profit. Yeah, even I can do that. All right, so what about demand? What about demand? So we see demand growing, and this chart I think is very telling. You can grow if you look back in the 1950s, really through the year 2000, we saw pretty linear growth in the amount of generation on the grid. And you can see some other things in here: petroleum, natural gas, coal. All of these things, their percentage of the production. But once you get up to about the year 2000, all the way to 2020, that growth is pretty stagnant, right? The utility demand, a lot of that comes from efficiencies. We're doing the same economic activity, or we're growing the economic activity with the same amount of input, with the same amount of energy. That's all good, but then I would argue that's an anomaly. It's a period of time when we've seen economic growth without this substantial growth in energy input. I found a couple of charts here in a second. I guess there one more area here before we get to them, but I think that's all about to change. It's when we start talking about the transition of the EV, when you talk about the electrification of the automobile, and we're seeing it happen, we're seeing it legislated. Transportation currently takes up 27% of the power input in this nation. That's primarily petroleum. Well, now you're going to change that from petroleum to electricity. So you're essentially adding 27% growth to the electric grid if it transitions 100%. Data centers, they're currently about 1.5%, but we're looking to see that double. So that's another 1.5% growth just from that. Cryptocurrency, well, it's currently 1% of the use on that's weird. 1% of the global consumption of electricity is to make things like Bitcoin. Seriously? But we're seeing that increase. We're seeing it increase dramatically. Artificial intelligence, the buzzword of the decade, right? Well, they're anticipating that could be as much as 10% of the electric usage in running artificial intelligence. Well, that's new. That's a new addition to the grid. So now we're up to about 40% growth by 2030. And then if industry electrifies, which is 33% of our electric consumption, primarily natural gas, if it transitions to electric, well, who knows? Within 20 years, we may see a 70% increase in electric use. And all of our models at the moment are being geared towards stagnant or slowly growing electric use. This is just showing how much of that is currently natural gas. So I found these two models here, and they're from two different agencies within the United States government. So the first model is really just talking about the bottom one here is from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, and it's more looking at what is the mix, the energy mix. But the thing I found interesting is if you look at the generation predictions, relatively flat, between now and what is that? It's pretty small on my page, but is that 2050 there? Yeah. Now in 2050, not significant growth in generating capacity. There's a significant difference in the energy mix. But then you look at NREL, and they're looking at, okay, well, what's energy demand? And at the high end, which I think is understated, now you're shooting up there to a lot of difference between what one part of the government is saying we're going to be generating and what another part of the government is saying we're going to be needing. You know, like I said in the headline, Houston, we got a problem here. We got a significant problem. So we're going to be faced with energy shortages very quickly. And how do we deal with that? I mean, a lot of the people who work in this industry understand this. And I can sympathize. I was talking to a guy, a local electrical co-op, and he's saying, why are we shutting down all these coal power plants just when we're going to be needing the power? You know, and I go, yeah, well, you know what? I can sympathize. Yeah. I mean, I like it that they're being shut down, but you know, just because I like it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. You know, it might be that we need it plus, you know, so that's a big issue. So in summary, what I'm saying here is the utility grid is not well maintained. It's poorly managed and corrupt. It's expensive. There's no national plan. It's already heavily subsidized by the federal government. It's not ready for future expansion needs. Can't even handle what we currently need. And the people in charge of it are placing obstacles in the way of fixing this problem. So the prosecution rests its case for nationalization of the power grid, which would probably create an even bigger problem. Yeah, Pete, you got to.
Yeah, I just want to remind people that while the transition to EVs is ongoing, the transition from oil and the considerable use of electricity to refine oil into gasoline, etc., we will see a considerable reduction in that. Our Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy, reports that something close to 6 kilowatt hours of electricity is used to refine a gallon of gasoline. And if we put that electricity into an EV, it would go about a half as far as a gallon of gasoline. So a lot of the electricity the EVs will need will come from unpowering our oil refineries.
Yep, good point. Good point. Anybody else have anything they want to add into that?
Yeah, I have a comment. It seems to me, Jay, you make a powerful argument for nationalizing the electric generation and grid and everything in between. But you also admit that that is not likely to happen. But Economics 101 tells you that if you are in fact right about one thing, which is what we're going to eat in energy, and you're also right about the other model, which says we're not going to be increasing our capacity significantly, then you have a solution. The solution is that the price of per kilowatt hour is going to skyrocket to balance demand and supply. That's the inevitable outcome of the scenarios that you're painting. Now, at that point, you're going to see everything change overnight because the resistance by the utilities will disappear simply because of public pressure or maybe Bill Gates will come up with this fusion reactor that can be mass produced and placed in places where it's demanded. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you know, supply and demand would say that the price of electricity would go up in the short term, you know, because of, you know, if our demand increases, but our supply does not increase adjacent to that. One thing I would argue, and this is sort of a rebuttal to my own argument that I just made here, that if you look at the fact that we already have twice the generating capacity as currently exists, waiting in line to be built, and that it's only the interconnection process that's delaying that, if the government used the threat of nationalization to get those utilities out of the way on this interconnection issue and just said, you know what, we're gonna use all this new artificial intelligence to actually get these things approved, you know, we could see this boom in short-term production. Now, then you get into supply chain issues and all of that. Can you really double or triple the grid in such a short period of time? But at least it would unstick one of these constriction points in this transition phase. And I think we need to, I would argue that the best use of my argument about nationalizing the grid is not to end up with a nationalized grid, but basically to dope slap these utilities into compliance with what they already should be doing. You need some people who can at least make a credible threat of nationalization in order to get these guys out of their position of complacency. So,
well, Jay, if there is beholden to the government as you suggest, because they just follow a program to make a profit, why don't the government just change the rules? I'd say the only thing worse than our existing system is turning it over to the guys who gave us Afghanistan, the Ukraine, Gaza,
yeah.
and the rest of it.
Okay.
So
well,
I'm not fighting for the existing system, Jay, but your answer doesn't seem to be filling my heart with joy or confidence.
I don't disagree with you, Don. So, yeah, I think you're probably right. One of the biggest issues there, of course, is the bodies that regulate the utilities currently are dominated by and controlled by the utilities. So we really need an independent regulatory body, you know,
Right.
that with new rules that are actually enforced. And, you know, so I think it's one of those sort of truisms in politics. You say, some people claim to be for bigger government, some people claim to be for smaller government. Most everybody will say we want better government, you know, so let's have government that actually does what it's supposed to do and does what it says it does. And let's have utilities who actually do what they are supposed to do and that they claim to do, you know, so I think this is a national discussion that needs to take place, but I suspect it's not going to take place until there's some disaster, you know, something that happens, a 9/11 type event, you know, that affects our electric grid. When I say that, I don't mean somebody's going to cause it's terrorist related. I'm just saying something of that magnitude that catches the public attention, you know, to that extent, that's going to precipitate some of this.
Would separating the production from transmission, sort of like getting rid of vertical integration, accomplish the same thing without nationalizing?
Yeah, I think we're seeing that happen anyway. You know, the generating facilities are basically becoming investor owned and investors who are not the utilities. So we're moving in that direction. I don't know that that's going to be the total solution, part of the solution, but I don't think that's the solution. I'm not sure. I think what we're going to need to see on some levels is we've seen generation being broken up through deregulation. Now we need to see distribution broken up and transmission broken up, where competitors like Apple or Google or those guys can buy access to the grid and actually offer competitive distribution on the existing infrastructure. So for instance, AEP or First Energy, currently they own and operate all of those lines, but those lines are on the public right of way and those lines are a public utility. So if they're given fair market rent for a certain portion of that capacity to allow other players into that marketplace, I think we'll see greater innovation and maybe even you know, lower prices. Who knows? Yeah, Bill? You're muted there, Bill. There you
I
go.
think Tommy's suggestion in the chat is a good one. I think that some of the pressure from bulking up the transmission and distribution system will be necessarily taken care of by generating this on rooftops where it's used. I think that's a great idea. I think that's where it has to inevitably end up. we just can't bulk up the system enough to be able to produce all the power that's required coming from centralized sources.
Yeah, I think we're going to see in a couple of decades a diagram that shows back in the bad old days, 99% of the power came from utilities and only 1% was owner owned. And in today's marketplace, it's 15%. And in 10 years, we anticipate it'll be 30%. And, you know, so I think we're going to see a transition to owner owned utilities, you know.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I'm seeing we're coming to the end of this. I appreciate the discussion on that, and I appreciate your attention. And we'll see you not next week, but the week after. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jay.
Sure thing.